The sound she made was not a scream. A scream is a thing with air behind it, a thing a body decides to do. This was smaller than that, and worse. It was the noise a person makes when the pain arrives before the understanding does. A short, wet catch in the throat, cut off halfway, and then nothing at all. Because by then she had her arm clamped against her ribs and her teeth shut, and she was already trying not to be a problem for anybody. 20 years old, right forearm, wrist to elbow. A full pot of coffee, 4 minutes off the brewer, poured slow and steady like a man watering a plant. 2 seconds, maybe 3. 7 men sat in that room and watched it happen, and not one of them stood up. Behind the bar, a 67-year-old man in a gray work shirt with the sleeves rolled past his elbows set down the glass he had been drying and set down the towel beside it. And he did not move either. Gray hair, cut short every third Wednesday. Big hands gone quiet in the way hands do when they have spent 22 years pouring beer instead of doing what they used to do. What the man with the coffee pot did not know was who he had just done that in front of. A long time ago, men with far worse records than his used to lower their voices when that old man's name came up in a room. Nobody in the dog iron that Thursday evening had the first idea what was coming, and the one who understood at least was Del Prine, 31 years old, who put the empty pot back on the burner and walked out into the rain laughing at something one of his own men said. 2 days later, at 5:20 in the evening, that same girl walked back through that same door, carrying a 4-way tire iron, and 7 men who had sat still on Thursday had to decide out loud whether she was the one who got to swing it. 19 men came down Route 12 on Saturday night. Not one of them left that gravel lot the same way he arrived. Stay with me on this one, because you need all of it, and you need it in order. It started about 40 minutes earlier than that, 6:10 in the evening, the second Thursday in October, and it had been raining since noon, the kind of slow, gray rain that does not fall so much as it settles, that gets into the gravel and turns the whole lot the color of a wet nickel. The Dog Iron Roadhouse sits 9 miles east of Kettle Ford on State Route 12. Cinder block on 3 sides, and cedar siding on the front. A gravel apron out ahead of it, big enough for maybe 30 vehicles, and a hand-painted sign on 2 steel posts that Emmett Rue Carver repainted himself every second spring with a can of exterior enamel and a brush he cleaned properly afterward. Inside there was a bar 22 feet long, oak, with a lip on the customer's side worn pale where 40 years of forearms have rested. There are 11 stools. There is a fireplace on the west wall that has not been lit since the state changed the code. And standing in that fireplace are the 2 iron andirons the place is named for, the dog irons, black and pitted, and older than anybody who drinks there. There is a jukebox that takes quarters, and only quarters. There was a hallway to the restrooms with a bare bulb in it. There was a kitchen behind a swinging door with a pass-through window cut in the wall. And in that window, there was a pane of glass on a slide track that Emmett installed himself because he did not like the smell of the fryer getting into the barroom. Remember that pane of glass. You are going to need it later. That Thursday, there were 7 men in the barroom, and 1 girl working the floor, and 1 man behind the bar. And every single one of them could have told you what the others were drinking without looking. Dutch Vanek, 71 years old, sat closest to the door, because that is where he had sat since 1979, and because his hip did not care for the walk to the back. He had an oxygen bottle in the bed of his truck that his daughter had bought him, and that he refused to carry indoors. Buford Latimer, 63, everybody called him Boo, a welder for 38 years, deaf in the left ear from it, drinking ginger ale because he had quit in 1994 and never once made a speech about it. Ray Elgin Pyle, 66, hauled cattle for 31 years and kept his reading glasses on a bootlace around his neck. Sonny Deal, 58, the baby of them, roofer, 2 ex-wives, counted his change twice every time and apologized for it every time. Tom Amos, 69, who had actually preached for 6 years in a block church outside Bell Springs and who never quoted a word of scripture at anybody after he stopped. Marvin Kroll, 69, who had been 19 years old in a place in 1969 that he had never named out loud in that building, who ate the same sandwich every Thursday, ham and yellow mustard, and who cut it in half before he ate it. And Lloyd Neep, 67, called cricket since childhood for reasons nobody could reconstruct, a mechanic with 2 fingers gone off his left hand at the second knuckle, who laughed at his own jokes about a half beat before the punchline. 7 of them. All that was left in that county, of the Hale County Wheelmen, patched in 1968 by 4 men who came home from the service and could not sit still in a house. There had been 31 of them once. There were 7 now, and their bikes sat under covers most of the year, and their knees were shot, and every one of them still put the vest on to come drink on a Thursday, because the vest meant something to them that had nothing to do with anybody else. The girl working the floor was Wren Odell, 20 years old, 5'3" in the shoes she wore for the job, dark hair pulled back so tight it looked painful, and a green apron with 2 pockets, the left one for her pad, the right one for the corkscrew and the crayon she used to write on the paper mats when kids came in, which was almost never. She had made a fresh pot of coffee at 4 minutes past 6, because Ray Pyle liked a cup after his supper, and because the pot on the burner had been sitting since 3. She had wiped down the 2 tables by the window. She had carried a bus tub back to the kitchen and set it in the sink and come back out. That is what she was doing when the door opened at 12 minutes past 6 and let in the rain smell and 3 men. Del Prine came first, 31, 6'2", a canvas work coat he wore in every weather, a beard he kept short, and a habit of standing with his weight on his heels so his belly came out ahead of him. The posture of a man who wants you to understand that he does not have to hurry. Behind him came a man named Cawley, 28, thin, wet hair flat to his skull, who did not go to the bar at all. Cawley took 2 steps in and turned and put his back against the wall beside the door and stood there with his right hand inside his coat. He never took it out. He never said one word. I want you to hold on to him, because 6 of the men in that room spent the next 2 days trying to explain about him, and could not find the language for it. And the 3rd man was young, maybe 22, and he stayed by the cigarette machine and looked at the floor a great deal. And he is not important except that he was there, and he saw it all, and he told the truth about it later, under oath, which is more than can be said for 2 of the others. Prine came up to the bar and put both hands flat on the oak and smiled. Emmett Carver was drying a Pilsner glass with a bar towel and did not stop drying it. Prine said it was the 10th of the month and that everybody on the route had settled up except one. And did Emmett know who that one was? Emmett said he did. Prine said $180 was not a lot of money for a man who owned a building. Emmett said that was true. Prine asked then what the problem was. Emmett folded the towel over his shoulder, set the glass down on the rubber mat, rim first, the way a bartender does, and said, quiet, that there was no problem, that Prine could come in any Thursday for the rest of his life, and there would be a cup of coffee for him on the house, but that there would not be $180, not that month or any month, because he did not owe it. $180. Say that number in your head and keep it there, because everything you are about to hear cost exactly $180 a month, and nobody involved ever once stopped to do that arithmetic out loud. Prine straightened up off the bar. He looked around the room. He looked at Dutch Vanek by the door and at the vest Dutch was wearing, and at the gray in Dutch's beard. And he made a small sound through his nose. And then he reached over to the end of the bar where the tip jar sat, a wide-mouth pickle jar with a strip of masking tape on it that said, "Thank you," in Wren's handwriting. And he picked it up in both hands and turned it upside down over the floor. He did not throw it. He did not smash it. He held it there and let it drain, quarters and dimes and singles and one $5 bill sliding out and spreading across the boards. And the coins went everywhere, under the stools, into the gap by the baseboard, and it took a long time, and the only sound in the room was money hitting wood. Then he set the empty jar back on the bar, upright, neat, exactly where it had been. That is a particular kind of thing to do. It is not about the money. Emmett Carver stood there and looked at him, and then said the only warning anybody got that night. He said, "You have made your point, son. Go on home now." That was it. That was the chance. It was offered at 6:14 in the evening in front of 8 witnesses, and it was free, and it cost nothing to take. And I want you to remember that it was offered, because there are people who will tell you the old man went looking for what came after, and they are lying. And there is a recording that proves they are lying, and we will get to that. Prine did not go home. He walked down the length of the bar to the far wall where a framed photograph hung between the beer clock and the fire extinguisher case. A photograph nobody in that county had ever asked a single question about. And he took it off its nail with one hand and let it fall. The frame hit the boards face down, and the glass in it cracked from corner to corner with a sound like a knuckle popping. And Emmett Carver did not move for that either. He stood behind his bar with a towel on his shoulder and his hands open at his sides. And he looked at that photograph on the floor with an expression that Boo Latimer described afterward as the look of a man watching something he had already buried get dug up in front of company. And that should have been the end of it. 2 acts, a mess to sweep, a frame to reglaze, and 3 men going back out into the rain with a story to tell. It would have been a bad night and nothing more. What made it the other thing was that Wren Odell walked over and bent down and picked up the photograph. She was not being brave. She would tell you that herself. She was doing what she had done every shift for 14 months, which was pick up what was on the floor, because that was her floor. She got it in both hands, and she turned it over to see how bad the glass was, and she said, not loud, without looking up, that he did not have to do that. Prine asked her what she said. She stood up with the frame against her chest, and she said it again. She said he did not have to do that. And Del Prine reached behind him without looking, because he had been standing beside the coffee station the whole time, and his hand closed on the handle of a glass pot with 64 ounces of fresh coffee in it. And he brought it around, and he took her wrist with his other hand and turned her arm over so the soft side was up, and he poured. Not fast. That is the part the 7 of them could not get past afterward. A man who panics throws it. A man who is angry throws it. Prine tipped the pot at an angle and adjusted, and walked it from the heel of her hand up the inside of her forearm to the crook of her elbow, and the steam came up off her skin, and that sound came out of her, that short, wet catch. And then she stopped making any sound at all. 2 seconds. Maybe 3. Then he set the pot back on the burner, right side up, on the plate, the way you would if you meant to come back for a refill. He let go of her wrist. She went down onto one knee, still holding the photograph, because she never once let go of the photograph. And Del Prine turned around to the room and said, into a silence you could have stood a spoon up in, that he would be back on the 10th of November. and the young one by the cigarette machine got the door, and Cauley went out backward with his hand still inside his coat, and the three of them walked across the gravel through the rain, and one of them said something, and Prine laughed. 7 men, 22 feet of oak bar, a 67-year-old man standing behind it with a bar towel on his shoulder. And not one human being in that building moved for 11 seconds. That is not an estimate. The camera over the register has a clock on it. Now, that is the part everybody wants to skip straight past, and I know it. And I'm going to make you wait anyway, because if you do not understand exactly who that old man had been before he was a man drying glasses, then what he does on Saturday night is just noise. And if you do not understand exactly why he stood still on Thursday, you will spend the rest of this story thinking he was a coward. And he was not a coward. And by the end of it, you are going to want to have been on his side the whole way through. So we are going to stop the clock right there. Rain on the roof, coins on the floor. A girl on one knee holding a broken picture frame against her apron, and an old man with his hands open. The dog iron opened its doors at 20 minutes to 11 in the morning, and it had opened at 20 minutes to 11 in the morning every single day for 22 years. Not 11, not 10:30, 10:40. Nobody in Hale County had ever gotten a straight answer about why, and after the first 4 or 5 years, people stopped asking and started using it, the way you use anything reliable. Farmers set their watches by it. A man named Purvis, who drove a propane truck, used to say he did not need a clock. He needed to know whether Rue's door was open yet. In 22 years, that door had been late exactly twice, once for an ice storm and once for a funeral. And both times he had taped a piece of cardboard over the window with the reason written on it, because he took the view that if people were counting on you, you owed them an explanation, and not an excuse. The smell of the place at 10:40 in the morning was coffee and floor soap and cold ash out of that dead fireplace. And by noon, it was coffee and hot grease. And by 6, it was coffee and grease and wet denim. And there are men in that county in their 50s who will tell you that if you blindfolded them and walked them into the dog iron, they would know where they were in one breath. Emmett Rue Carver was 67 years old. Everybody called him Rue. He was 6'1", and he had been 6'2", and he weighed 210 pounds and had weighed 240 once. Gray hair, cut short, a gray work shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbow, tucked in, and the same brown belt for so long the tongue had worn a groove. Boots, resoled twice. Big he was, but in a way that had nothing at all to do with size. He had a way of standing behind that bar with his weight even on both feet that made a room organize itself around him without anybody deciding to. He did not talk much. When he did talk, people leaned in without meaning to, and then afterward could not remember whether he had raised his voice, and the answer was that he never had. Not once. Not in 22 years. Not even the night 2 men from Sinclair started swinging at each other over a woman who was not present. He came around the end of the bar that night, and he did not touch either one of them. And he said something to them that nobody else heard, and both of those men sat down, and one of them cried. That was 2004. People still brought it up. Nobody could ever tell you what he said. His hands. You want to look at a man's hands. His were wide across the palm, with heavy knuckles, and the 2 middle knuckles on the left hand did not stand up the way the others did. They were flat. They sat lower, like somebody had taken a file to them a long time ago. There was a white line of scar tissue that ran from the base of his thumb around into the meat of the hand. He kept his nails short and clean. He wore a wedding band on a chain around his neck under his shirt instead of on his finger, and he had worn it that way so long that the chain had polished a shallow line into his collarbone. Those hands, for 22 years, had done exactly 4 things. They had turned a key at 20 minutes to 11. They had poured. They had wiped. And every single morning, before he unlocked the front door, they had reached up under the overhang of the bar at the 3rd stool and touched a hickory axe handle bolted into 2 spring clips. Just checked it. Just laid 2 fingers on it, and then come away. 22 years. 8,000 and some mornings. He had never once needed it. He checked it anyway. The way a man checks a fire extinguisher he prays he will die without using. There was a stool, second from the far end, that nobody sat on. New people sat on it sometimes, and nobody made a scene. But within about 4 minutes, somebody would find a reason to move them, and the stool would go back to being empty. There was no sign on it. There did not need to be. Everybody in there knew whose it had been, and the ones who did not know learned by watching. Ren Odell came into that building for the first time on an August afternoon 14 months before the coffee. She was 19 then. She came in with a duffel bag and a car outside with a Tennessee plate and a rear tire she had put a can of sealant into twice that week. And she asked, standing just inside the door with the light behind her, whether they were hiring. Emmett Carver looked at her for about as long as it takes to pour a short beer. He did not ask her where she was from. He did not ask her why a 19-year-old girl was 300 miles from a Tennessee plate on a Tuesday with everything she owned in a canvas bag. He did not ask about the marks on the inside of her upper arm, 4 of them, in a pattern that anybody who has ever worked in a bar has seen before and knows the shape of. He never asked her one single question about any of that. Not that day, and not in the 14 months after. What he said was, "Can you carry 4 plates?" She said she could carry 6. He said that was too many, and to start Thursday. Then he took a green apron off the hook by the kitchen door and put it on the bar in front of her, and he took a key off his own ring, the back door key, and he set that on the apron. On day 1, to a stranger. And he poured her a cup of coffee she had not asked for and set it beside the key and went back to what he was doing. Now, a girl who has learned early not to trust quickly does not take a thing like that as kindness. She takes it as a debt, and she watches to see when the bill comes. Wren told a woman in a hospital hallway 2 days after the coffee that she had spent her first 3 months at the dog iron waiting for Rue Carver to ask her for something, and that when he never did, it made her angrier than if he had. And then it made her cry in her car in the lot one night in November, for reasons she could not explain to herself at the time. He never once raised his voice at her, not when she dropped a tray of glassware in her second week, not when she rang a $140 tab into the register as 14. He came around, looked at the register tape, said, "That will teach us both to check," and fixed it. And that was the end of it. She learned the taps, then the well, then the books, and by month 9 she was closing on Sundays by herself, and by month 12 there were regulars who would wait for her section. She got sharp in that building. She got a little of herself back in that building. She started leaving the top button of her collar undone, which sounds like nothing, and which was not nothing. And around that same building, over about the same stretch of time, the county was going quietly bad in a way that nobody could point at. It did not arrive with sirens. It arrived with a laminated folder and a friendly young man in a clean truck. It arrived as a service. That is the part people always get wrong when they tell this story in bars now. Everybody imagines masks and bats from the first day. It was never that. It was a folder and a smile and a monthly rate. The outfit was called Tolliver Asset Recovery and Route Services, and for about 11 years, It had been an honest-to-God business, or close enough to it, run by a man named Ansel Tolliver, out of a metal building on Quarry Road with a gravel yard and a scale and 9 trucks. Ansel repossessed farm equipment for 2 banks, ran vending machines into 40-odd businesses across 3 counties, serviced the coin laundries, and stocked the ATM in the front of the feed store. He was not a good man, and he was not a bad one. He was a man who had figured out that if you own the machines inside 100 buildings, you know more about a county than the sheriff does. Ansel died in a hospital bed in March of the year before all this, 61 years old, of something in his liver, and he left the business to his nephew because his own boy had gone to Tulsa and would not take his calls. The nephew was Merritt Tolliver, 26 years old. And I am going to tell you about him properly, because the failure mode of a story like this one is to make the other side into a monster. And he was not a monster. He was a frightened young man holding something too heavy for him. And if you cannot feel that by the end of this, then I have told it badly. Merritt Tolliver was 5'9" and built like a man who had done real work for about 2 years and then stopped. He had a burn scar on the back of his right hand in the shape of a comma, about 1.5 inches long, from a manifold when he was 15, and he had a habit of running his thumb over it while other people were talking, and once you noticed that, you could not stop noticing it. He wore a quarter-zip pullover and clean boots. He had a good smile, wide, easy, quick to arrive. It never once got as far as his eyes. People described that smile to me 4 separate times without any of them having heard the others say it. He took over on a Monday in April, and inside 90 days, he had changed the entire nature of the thing. Ansel had charged a business $40 a month for the vending service and been happy with it.
Merritt sent out a letter on new letterhead announcing a route protection and asset security fee of $180 per month, effective the first of the following month, applicable to all serviced locations, with the word recommended in capital letters in one paragraph and the word required nowhere at all, because the young man had a talent for the space between 2 words. $180. For a diner in a town of 1,900 people, that is 2 shifts of a dishwasher. For a beauty shop with 3 chairs, it is real money. And most of them paid, and here is why. The first 3 that did not pay had things happen, not to them, to their property. Sugar in the tank of a delivery van at the feed store, which is $1,100 of fuel system. A dumpster fire behind the Kettleford Diner at 2 in the morning that scorched the back wall and cost them 4 days of health inspection. And at Ola Beecham's beauty shop, 73-year-old woman, 41 years in the same storefront, somebody came in the night and cut the cord off every dryer at the wall plate. 8 dryers, 6 inches of cord left on each one. Nobody was ever charged with any of it, and Merritt Tolliver was 2 counties away every time, with a receipt in his pocket. And after the 3rd one, there was not a business on that route that did not pay the $180. Nobody fought it. Fighting it got your equipment ruined. Or worse. He built the whole thing on fear instead of respect, because fear was faster, and because he was 26 years old and he had 11 months of runway and a banknote his uncle had signed, and respect takes 10 years. And here is the wound underneath it, and I am going to give it to you straight, because it explains the young man without excusing him 1 inch. Merritt Tolliver's father was Ansel's younger brother, a man named Dale, and Dale Tolliver was, by every account, gentle. Worked a parts counter for 22 years, sang in a church, and when Merritt was 9 years old, he was standing beside his father at a gas station out on the Bell County line when a man in a dually accused Dale of scratching his door with a pump handle and got out and took Dale Tolliver by the front of the shirt in front of his son and shoved him back into the side of their own car twice, and then slapped him. Open hand, twice. And Dale Tolliver said, "I'm sorry." He said it out loud to the man who had just slapped him in front of his 9-year-old boy. And then he got in the car and they drove home, and he never mentioned it again as long as he lived. And he lived another 14 years. Merritt told that story exactly one time, at 19, drunk, to a girl who later told it to somebody else, which is the only reason anybody knows it. And the thing he said at the end of it was not, "I hated that man." It was, "I could not stop hearing my dad say, sorry." So a young man decides, somewhere down under where decisions get made, that nobody is ever going to make him say that word. And the shortest road to that is to be the one people say it to. That is not an excuse. 200 people in that county paid for that gas station, $180 at a time. But it is a reason, and reasons matter, and a man who cannot see the reason has not understood the story. The dog iron got its letter in June. Emmett Carver read it standing at the register with his glasses down his nose, folded it in half, and put it in the drawer under the register, where he kept things he intended to keep and did not intend to act on. In July, a young man came out and talked to him about it, and left with nothing. In August, another one came, and in September, and every time the answer was the same, and it was one word long, and the word was no. Not a speech, not an argument. No. He said it the way another man would say the time. In the last week of September, Merritt Tolliver came himself. That was the only time he ever set foot in that building, before the night everything happened. And about 14 people saw it, and every one of them has told it since. It was a Wednesday, early, maybe 2 in the afternoon, and the place had 4 people in it. He came in wearing the quarter zip and clean boots, and he did not sit down. He stood at the bar with his hands folded on the oak, and he was polite, genuinely polite. Please and thank you. And he laid the whole thing out like a young man presenting at a bank. He said he understood there had been some back and forth. He said he wanted to reset the relationship. He said the fee covered route service and asset protection, and that his people had gotten out ahead of 2 separate incidents at other locations this year alone. He said, and this is the part everybody quotes, that a building this old, with this much wood in it and this many miles of empty road around it, was frankly underprotected, and that he lost sleep about places like it. And then he said the number, 180 a month. He said it like it was a small thing, and it is a small thing. That is precisely what makes the rest of this so hard to sit with. Emmett Carver listens to all of it without interrupting. He listens the way a man listens to a weather report. And when the young man finished, Emmett reached under the bar and got a cup, a white diner cup with a green stripe, and he set it down, and he filled it with coffee, and he pushed it across the oak to a 26-year-old who had just finished threatening his building. Poured for a man who had not asked. Then he said, "No." That was the entire refusal. One word, in a room where the loudest thing was the compressor on the beer cooler kicking on. Merritt Tolliver's smile flickered like a candle catching a draft it had not seen coming. He said, "I do not think you understood what I said." Emmett said he understood him fine. Merritt asked if he wanted to think it over. Emmett said no again. And then, because the young man was standing there with his mouth slightly open, he added the only other sentence he offered that day. He said, "You are welcome in here any time.
and your money is not. Most people telling Merritt Tolliver no in that county said it with their voice shaking. Rue Carver's did not shake at all. And that is the thing that made it impossible, do you see? Because a shaking no is a maybe. A shaking no is a man you can come back to. A flat no from a 67-year-old bartender in front of 4 witnesses in a building on a state route is a fact. And facts travel. Merritt Tolliver walked out and left the coffee sitting there untouched, steam still coming off it. And he did not slam the door. He closed it carefully, which is worse. And Emmett Carver picked up that cup and poured it out and washed it and dried it and put it back on the shelf with the others. Wren had been standing at the end of the bar with a stack of menus in her hands through the whole thing. When the truck pulled out, she asked him what that had been about, and Emmett Carver told her the only lie he ever told her in 14 months. He said, "It is nothing. It will blow over." She believed that, mostly. She was 20 years old, and she wanted to believe it. But somewhere underneath the calm, the old man understood exactly what kind of weather was rolling toward that building. And what he did not tell her was that he had made his decision the moment that young man's truck turned back onto Route 12. He only hoped it would not come to that. It came to that. Now, that photograph, the one Del Prine took off the wall on a Thursday in October and let fall on the floor. It hung between the beer clock and the fire extinguisher case, in a plain black frame, 11 inches by 14, and it had hung there since the day the doors opened. It was a color photograph gone orange, the way they all go, and it showed a field and a tree line and a creek bank, and in front of that, motorcycles. Not 6, not 20. Rows of them, angled in, front wheels cut, going back into the picture until they got too small to count, and somebody counted once and got 140 and gave up. And standing among them, men. A lot of men. Vests and beards and belt buckles, and about half of them looking at the camera and about half of them looking at something off to the left. There was no writing on the front. On the back, in pencil, in a hand that was not Emmett's, it said, Ashfall Creek, and then the month, and then 1981. In 22 years, exactly 3 customers had ever asked about that picture. 2 of them got the answer that it was some boys he used to know. The third one was a man passing through from out of state who stood in front of it for a good 90 seconds with his beer going warm in his hand, and then turned around and looked at Emmett Carver for a while, and then did not ask anything at all, and paid cash and left, and never came back. Cricket Neep saw that happen, and told the other 6 about it, and none of them made anything of it. Because you do not. Because the rule in a place like the Dog Iron is that a man's history is his own property, and you do not go in there without an invitation. So let me take you into it, because you have earned it, and because they never asked. Emmett Rue Carver was born in 1952 in a rented house with a pump on the porch. His father worked a quarry and lost a leg to it in 1961 and drank about it afterward. He went in the service at 18 and came out at 22 and did not talk about the middle part. And the only thing anybody could ever get out of him about it later was one sentence he said to Marvin Kroll one Thursday, about 8 years before all of this, when the 2 of them were alone and closing. Marvin said something about how there were nights it still came in on him, and Emmett said, "I know it." That is all he said. 2 men, 40 years apart from 2 different places, and that was the entire conversation. And Marvin Kroll said afterward it was the closest thing to being understood he had had since 1970. He came back from that, and he did what a lot of them did in those years. He got on a motorcycle, and he went.
And he found, out there, a whole country of men who were not sleeping right either. And he stayed in it for about 11 years, and he was somebody in it. Now hear me carefully, because this matters. He was not the biggest man in that world, and he was not the meanest, and he was never, at any point, the one with the most people behind him. What he was the one both sides would let in the room. Between 1977 and 1981, there was a war going on across 9 counties in that part of the country between 2 organizations that I am not going to name. And it was not a war anybody put in a newspaper, because in a war like that, nobody calls the newspaper. It ran 4 years. It cost 22 men their lives that anybody could count, and probably more that nobody could. It burned 2 clubhouses and a garage with a family living over it. And it got to the point where men were carrying their patches in a saddlebag instead of on their backs so they could get through a gas station. And in September of 1981, at a place called Ashfall Creek, on a piece of a man's pasture that he was paid $400 to keep his family off of for 2 days, it stopped. Both sides came. Nobody surrendered. Nobody was ever punished. And no law enforcement agency in this country has 1 page about it in any file. And it stopped. There was a table. There was a piece of paper, and there was a man sitting at the head of that table who did not belong to either side, who had walked in, unarmed, in front of everybody, with his hands out from his body, who did not raise his voice 1 time in 11 hours, and who came out at the end of the 2nd day with 14 signatures on a page and a line of men shaking his hand. And what they called him, because a road name is a thing you get given and not a thing you pick, was Sunday. They called him that because of what happened when he showed up, which was that everything stopped. I am telling you what the man was so you can understand what the man gave up. Because in 1985, Emmett Carver got off the road entirely. He sold the bike. He put everything he had from that life into a green steel ammunition box with a rubber gasket in the lid, and he closed it. And he took a job driving a fuel truck in Hale County, and he married a woman named Cora Dell Bishop in 1986 in a courthouse in Kettleford with 2 strangers as witnesses. Cora, everybody called her Sixpence, and not 1 living soul, including her husband, could tell you where that started. She was 5'0", and she cut her own hair, and she was the only person on this earth who ever won an argument with that man. She ran the office at a grain elevator for 19 years and could do a column of figures in her head faster than the adding machine, and did it out loud to annoy people. She had a 1974 motorcycle she had bought herself at 23 with her own money before she ever met him, and she rode it hard for a decade, and then it came apart on her in 1991, and she started rebuilding it in the shed behind their house and never finished. It is still out there. It is under a canvas cover with a bungee around it, and on the pegboard above the bench, every tool hangs inside a black painted outline of itself that she brushed on with a 1/2-inch brush, because Cora Carver could not abide a tool being put down somewhere it did not live. 28 outlines. 2 of them, to this day, have nothing hanging in them, because those 2 wrenches were in the man's hand the last week she was alive, and he never could bring himself to put them back. They had 11 years. They did not have children, and I do not know why, and nobody living does. What they had was a house with a shed behind it and a routine. And on a Thursday afternoon in March of 1997, Cora Carver was driving home from the elevator on the Bell County Road, and a man came across the center line at 55 miles an hour and hit her almost square. He was not drunk. Everybody assumes drunk. He was not. He was a 22-year-old kid named Rusty Amble who had worked a double and fallen asleep, and who woke up 400 feet later with his life over. She lived 5 days,
Emmett Carver sat in a chair in a hallway on the 3rd floor of the hospital in Bell County, 41 miles from his own front door, for 5 days. And on the following Tuesday at 20 minutes to 11 in the morning, a nurse came out and told him. 10:40. That is where the hour comes from. 22 years of unlocking a door at 20 minutes to 11 in the morning, so that every single day of his life, the worst minute he ever lived, would have something in it. He never told one person that. Not one. Wren Odell figured it out 4 years after he died, holding a death certificate in her hand in a lawyer's office, and she had to go outside and stand in a parking lot for a while. Now here is the part that turns the whole story, and you have to have it before Saturday night, or Saturday night will not land right. For 11 days after the funeral, Emmett Carver had a piece of paper in the front pocket of his shirt, with Rusty Amble's address on it. Somebody gave it to him. He never said who. And a man who had been what he had been, with what he knew, with the people he could still call, had that address in his pocket for 11 days, and drove past that road twice. And on the 11th day, he went out to the cemetery instead, and stood at the foot of a grave that did not have a stone on it yet, because the stone took 6 weeks, and he made a promise, out loud, alone, to a woman in the ground. He said it one word at a time. He told exactly one person about it, 22 years later, at 1:30 in the morning in an empty bar room, and that person told me. He said, "Not ever again." He stood there and put a space after each one so it would hold, and then he put the condition on it, because he was not a fool and he had lived in the actual world, and the condition was this: unless it is for somebody who cannot. And then the second half, which is the half that hung him on that Thursday in October like a coat on a nail. Not 1 second past the moment it stops being protecting and starts being paying back. Do you understand now? Do you see what he was standing inside of behind that bar with the coffee steam coming up off that girl's arm? It was 2 seconds, maybe 3. There is no man alive at any age who crosses 22 feet of open floor and gets there in 2 seconds. And he knew it inside the first half of the first second. And after that, it was over. It was already done. It had already happened. And everything he might have done to Del Prine from that instant forward was not protecting one thing. It was paying back. And he had told a woman in the ground that he would not. So the man stood still and kept his word, and it cost him more than any fight he ever had, and 7 of his friends watched him do it and thought they were watching him break. He bought the dog iron with the insurance money in 1997 because he could not be in that house at 10:40 in the morning. He opened it that October, 22 years. And the green steel box went under the floor by the kitchen stove, under a section of board he cut himself and fitted so well you could stand on it. And it stayed there, and every so often he stood on that board on purpose. All right, now we go back to the room. Rain on the roof, coins on the floor. 11 seconds. And then Emmett Carver moved. And he did not move toward the door. He came around the end of the bar the way he did everything, slow, unhurried, like a man with all the time in the world. And he went past Dutch Vanek, and past Ray Pyle, and past the empty stool second from the end, and he went down on one knee on the boards next to Wren Odell, and he took the photograph out of her hands and set it aside without looking at it, and he said, "Let me see." She would not let him see. She had her arm folded against her stomach with her other hand over it. He said her name once, quiet. She showed him.
The skin from the heel of her right hand up to the inside of her elbow had already gone the color of a boiled shrimp, and it was already coming up in a line of blisters along the outside edge where the coffee had run and pooled against the fold of her apron. He put his hand under her elbow, not on the burn, under it, and he stood her up and walked her back behind the bar to the deep sink, and he turned the cold tap on and put her arm under it, and he stood there beside her and held her wrist so she could not pull it out, and he watched the second hand on the beer clock. 14 minutes, not 10. 14. He timed it. He did not say anything for most of it. Twice he said, "I know." That was all. Behind him, in the bar room, 7 men sat in a silence that had a texture to it. Nobody drank. The compressor on the cooler cycled off, and the loudest thing in the dog iron was the cold water running into a steel sink, and a girl breathing through her nose in short pulls. Sonny Deal got down on the floor and started picking up the money, and he got maybe $1.50 of it into his hand, and then stopped and just knelt there. Preacher Tom Amos had both hands flat on the table in front of him, and was looking at them like they belonged to somebody else. Dutch Vanek, 71 years old, president of a club that had been 31 men once, had gotten as far as putting one hand on the edge of the bar to push himself up, and had not gotten up, and would spend the rest of his life inside that half-second. Marvin Kroll had not moved at all. Marvin Kroll had been the only one in that room who understood, from the moment Cawley put his back to the wall by the door with his hand inside his coat, exactly what shape the evening had. And he had made an arithmetic he had made once before in his life, and he hated the answer both times. At 6:41, Emmett shut the water off and wrapped her forearm loose in clean bar towels, and he took his own coat off the hook by the office door and put it over her shoulders because she had started shaking, which is what a body does when the adrenaline lets go of it. And he looked up at the room for the first time, and there were 7 faces looking back at him. And this is what he said. He said, "Dutch, lock it behind me." He did not say one word about what any of them had done or not done, not that night, not the next day, not ever. And every one of those 7 men would have taken a beating instead. He drove her 41 miles to the hospital in Bell County in a 19-year-old pickup with a bad heater. He did not speed. She asked him twice to just take her home. He said no both times, the same flat way he had said it to a young man across a bar. At the desk they asked for insurance, and she did not have any, and he took a fold of bills out of his front pocket and put $400 on the counter and said to start with that and to call him for the rest. 2nd-degree burns, partial thickness, 7 1/4 inches by 3 at the widest, with a strip along the ulnar edge they were worried about. They cleaned it, which took a while, and she made that sound again twice and then stopped again. Silver sulfadiazine and a non-adherent dressing, and a tetanus shot, and instructions, and a prescription for something she said she did not want. And a nurse asked her, with the door shut and the old man out in the hall, whether she wanted to talk to somebody about how she got burned, because that is the question they are trained to ask when a 20-year-old girl comes in at 9 at night with a 67-year-old man. And Renaudel said, "It was not him." And then she said, "He is the only reason I have got a job." And then she cried for the first time that whole night about that, and not about her arm. Emmett Carver sat in a plastic chair in a hallway on the 3rd floor of a hospital in Bell County for 2 hours and 40 minutes, with his hat on his knee. Same floor, same hallway, same smell of that pink soap they use. He had not been inside that building since 1997, and he had not planned to ever be again. He sat there and looked at a spot on the wall,
and a nurse walked past him twice and later said she thought he was asleep sitting up. He was not asleep. They got back to Kettle Ford at midnight. He drove her to the room she rented over the hardware store and walked her up the outside stairs and waited on the landing until he heard the bolt go over. And then he drove 9 miles back east to the dog iron and let himself in and turned on one light. And then a 67-year-old man got a broom and a dustpan and swept up $70-some in coins by himself at 1 a.m. On his knees for the ones under the baseboard, with a flat knife to get them out. He counted it and put it in the jar and set the jar on the back bar. He got the shop vac for the glass. He picked the photograph up off the floor and turned it over and looked at it for a while with the frame in both hands, and then he set it face down on the bar and left it there, and he did not hang it back up. And Wren asked him about that later, and he said he had to get glass cut. That was true, and it was not the reason. And then he sat down on a stool on the customer side of his own bar, which he had not done in 22 years, and he poured himself 2 fingers of something he did not drink, and he sat there until about 3:30 a.m, with the rain going on the roof and the ice machine dumping every so often, and once, at some point in there, he said something out loud in an empty room to a woman who has been dead since 1997. Nobody knows what. Friday morning, at 20 minutes to 11, the door of the dog iron opened. Of course it did. He swept the lot. He set the chairs down. He made coffee, and stood there for a second with the pot in his hand, and then made it anyway. Wren did not come in. He had told her not to for a week, and she had argued, and he had won. The 7 came in around 4 in the afternoon, all 7 together, which they never did. And they sat where they always sat, and they could not look at him, and he served them like it was any other Friday, and would not take their money. Dutch Vanek tried twice to start a sentence. Emmett put a hand flat on the bar in front of him and said, "Dutch." And Dutch stopped. By 6 o'clock Friday evening, that man believed, honestly believed, that the worst of it had already happened, and that what was left was a hospital bill, and a piece of glass to cut, and a girl who would flinch at the coffee station for a couple of months. He believed every word of that when he thought it. He was wrong. The worst of that week had not introduced itself yet. At 11 minutes past 7 on Friday evening, the phone on the wall by the register rang, the landline, the one with the cord, and Emmett Carver picked it up and said, "Dog iron?" And a voice on the other end said his full name. Not Rue, not Mr. Carver. It said, Emmett Rue Carver. And then it said something that made him set the towel he was holding down slower than he had set anything down all day. It said, "Were you at Ashfall?" Here is what had happened in the 25 hours since 3 men walked out of that building laughing. Tolliver Asset Recovery and Route Services worked out of a metal building on Quarry Road with a gravel yard, a truck scale nobody used anymore, and an office with a window unit in it. And in that office, keeping the books, running the routes, doing the licenses and the insurance, and the 17 things a young man does not know he has to do, was a man named Hoyt Breedlove, 62 years old. 2 full decades older than anybody else who worked there, and it had been that way since Ansell's time, and he had stayed on after Ansell died for 2 reasons, which were that he needed 4 more years to draw, and that he had made Ansell Tolliver a promise about the boy. Hoyt Breedlove wore a canvas cap he took off indoors. He had a bad shoulder. He had been, between the ages of 17 and 26, in a world that Merritt Tolliver and Del Prine and every other man in that yard knew about only from movies, and he had gotten out of it in 1984, with everything still attached,
which he considered the great good fortune of his life, and he had never once brought it up in 35 years. On Friday morning, Del Prine came into that office to drop a bag and stayed to tell the story, because a man like that cannot hold a story like that any more than a bucket with a hole in it can hold water. And he told it to the room, 3 young men and Hoyt, and he told it well. And he got laughs on the tip jar, and he did the thing with the coffee pot with his hand in the air, the pouring motion, walking it up an imaginary arm, and the young ones laughed at that too. And then he said the part that mattered. He said, and the old man just stood there. Whole room full of them, 7 of those old boys in their little vests, and the old fella behind the bar with his sleeves rolled up, and not one of them moved a muscle. Hoyt Breedlove had been signing a fuel log. He did not look up right away. When he did not ask about the girl. He did not ask about the 7. He asked one thing, and he asked it flat. He said, "What did he look like?" Prine said, "What?" Hoyt said it again, the one behind the bar. What did he look like? And Prine, enjoying himself, said, "Big old boy, gray, 65, 70, sleeves rolled up like he was about to do something and never did." And Hoyt said, "His hands." And Prine laughed and said, "What?" And Hoyt Breedlove said, "His left hand, the knuckles." And Del Prine stopped laughing, because something in the room had changed temperature, and he could feel it on his skin without knowing why. And he said, "Flat. 2 of them are flat, like they got stepped on." And Hoyt asked for the name, and one of the young ones said, "Everybody calls him Rue," and Hoyt said, "The rest of it." And the young one had to go to the route sheet to find it, and he read it off the page. Carver. Emmett R. Carver. DBA the dog iron. 180 per, 16 months arrears. Hoyt Breedlove went the color of old paper. He set the pen down on the fuel log, and he sat down on the edge of the desk, slowly, the way a man sits when his legs have quit consulting him. And then he took off his canvas cap and turned it over in his hands, twice, all the way around, looking down into it. And nobody in that office said anything, because when the oldest man in a room does that, everybody younger goes quiet and does not know why. Merritt Tolliver came in about a minute later, and he was in a good mood, because he had had 4 phone calls that morning from other locations on the route, 4, all wanting to know if what they had heard about the dog iron was true, and every one of those calls sounded like money to him. He clapped Prine on the shoulder, and then he saw Hoyt sitting on the desk with his cap in his hands, and he said, "What?" And Hoyt Breedlove said, "Sit down, Merritt." It took him 20 minutes. He told those 4 young men a story that not one of them had ever heard, and he told it badly, because he was not a storyteller, and it landed anyway. He told them about 4 years across 9 counties. He told them about a garage in a town he named that burned in 1979 with a family in the apartment over it. He told them that he had been 24 years old and standing at the gate of a horse trailer at the edge of a pasture in September of 1981, with a job so small it did not have a name, and that there were more motorcycles in that field than he had seen before or since, and that 2 organizations who had spent 4 years killing each other were standing 40 feet apart, and that everybody had come in expecting to leave in a hurry. And that in the middle of the afternoon, a man walked out from between the trucks with nothing in his hands and both arms out from his sides, and walked the whole way across that pasture at a walking pace, alone, and sat down at a folding table, and both sides let him. And Hoyt said, "You have to understand what I am telling you." Not because he was theirs, because he was nobody's. That was the entire thing. That was the whole reason it worked. And Prine said, So he was a negotiator, like a lawyer. And Hoyt Breedlove looked at him for a while, and then he said, before that, he was who they sent when the talking had already failed. He said, they called him Sunday, and Prine said, what does that mean? And Hoyt said, because when he showed up, everything stopped. Merritt Tolliver ran his thumb over the comma-shaped scar on the back of his hand about 11 times during that 20 minutes. And then he asked a question a 26-year-old asks. He said, Hoyt, that was almost 40 years ago. He said, that man is 67 years old, and he pours beer. He said, you just told me he stood there and let Dell scald a waitress and did nothing. What is he going to do? And Hoyt Breedlove said the thing that made it impossible for anybody to walk away. He said, I do not know. He said, and that is the problem. He said, if he was going to do it himself, he would have done it Thursday. So either he is done, or he is not doing it himself. Merritt said, meaning what? And Hoyt said, meaning, I cannot tell you. There is nobody left. He said, most of them are dead or in a home. He said, but I cannot promise you nobody comes, and I would rather you told me no than told me you do not know. There is a specific kind of dread that sits in a room after a man says, I do not know. A yes you can plan around. A no you can ignore. I do not know just sits there and drinks your coffee. And here is where it turned, and I want to be careful with it, because this is the exact hinge of the entire thing. And it did not turn on anger. It turned on arithmetic. Merritt Tolliver got up and went to the window and stood looking at 9 trucks in a gravel yard. And he did the math out loud, and Hoyt Breedlove listened to a 26-year-old talk himself off a cliff. He said, 4 calls this morning. He said, Ola Beecham's girl called the diner, and the diner called the tire shop. He said, by Monday, every location on that route knows an old man told me no 16 months running and put his hands in his pockets while my guy did what he did, and nothing happened to him. He said, 41 locations at $180 a month is $7,380, and the note on this building is $6,300. And if 6 of them stop paying, I am short. And if 12 of them stop, I am done. And if that place is open on Monday morning with the lights on and that old man behind the bar, they all stop. So it stopped being a collection. It became a cleanup. Not because a young man was angry, though he was, and not because his pride was hurt, though it was. Because a young man with a banknote had run the numbers and decided that the only asset he had left was other people's fear. And that fear is the one commodity in this world with a shelf life of about 72 hours. And Hoyt Breedlove stood in that office and heard him and said one more thing. And then he never said another word about it. And it was this. He said, you are about to provoke something you do not understand. And every man in this yard is going to have to stand in front of it. And you will not be standing there with them. Merritt Tolliver said, Saturday. He said it to Prine. He said, get everybody, and I mean everybody, and call Ronnie in Sinclair and get his people. And we go out there after close on Saturday when there is nobody in the road, and that building is not open on Monday. And Prine said, what does that mean exactly? And Merritt Tolliver said the sentence that got him 11 years, which was, I want it so nobody in this county ever says his name again. 19 men. That was the number. 7 from the yard, 6 that Prine called out of 2 counties,
4 that came down from Sinclair with a man named Ronnie Pell, and 2 more that nobody could ever fully account for. 7 vehicles, and an inventory that came out later in a courtroom, item by item, which was 11 axe handles and 2 pieces of half-inch rebar and 4 lengths of log chain and a Halligan bar somebody had taken off a fire department at some point, and a 5-gallon can of gasoline in the bed of a truck that never came out of it, and that 4 different men swore they did not know about, and 1 Smith & Wesson revolver, 38 caliber, 5-shot, that Merritt Tolliver took out of his uncle's desk drawer at 8:10 on Saturday evening and put in the front pocket of his pullover, and that not one man in that yard except Hoyt Breedlove knew he had. At 7:07 on Friday evening, Hoyt Breedlove parked his truck behind a closed implement dealership 11 miles from the yard and sat there for 4 minutes, and then dialed a number off the route sheet from memory, because he had typed it 400 times. And when a voice on the other end said, "Dog iron," he said, "Emmett Rue Carver." And then he said, "Were you at Ashfall?" There was a pause on that line, long enough that Hoyt looked at the phone to see if the call had dropped. Then Emmett Carver said, "Who is this?" And Hoyt said, "My name is not going to mean anything to you. I was 24. I held the gate on a horse trailer." And Emmett said, "Breedlove." And Hoyt Breedlove had to put his hand over his eyes, sitting in a truck behind an implement dealership at 62 years old, because a man he had met for 11 seconds in 1981 had just said his name off the top of his head. Hoyt told him all of it. 19 men, Saturday, after dark. Chains and handles, from the yard and Sinclair. He told him the young man had said the words out loud. He told him the 2 counties the men were coming from. And then he said, "I am not doing this for you. I am doing it because I made his uncle a promise, and because that boy is going to prison, or worse, and I would rather it be prison." And then he said, "So close it, lock it Saturday, and go somewhere. Take your truck and go to a motel in Bell County, and be somewhere with a receipt, and let them break a window they can pay for, and come back Sunday." And Emmett Carver said, "Thank you for the call." And Hoyt Breedlove said, "Do not thank me. Will you close it?" And there was that pause again. Then the old man said, "I have opened that door at 20 to 11 every morning for 22 years. And Hoyt said, "That is not an answer." And Emmett said, "It is the only one I have got." And then he said one more thing before he hung up, which Hoyt Breedlove repeated on a witness stand 9 months later, and which is the reason 2 of the charges stuck. He said, "Breedlove, when it goes bad, get in your truck and be somewhere else, because you are the only one of them that is going to be worth anything to anybody afterward." Saturday, 20 minutes to 11 in the morning, the front door of the Dog Iron Roadhouse opened, and a 67-year-old man in a gray work shirt swept the front step and put the chairs down and made a pot of coffee. It was clear that day, cold for October, that hard blue sky you get after 2 days of rain, and the gravel in the lot had that scrubbed look. He did the ordinary things. He rotated the beer stock, oldest to the front. He took the drip trays out and ran them through the sink. He cut a piece of glass to size at the hardware store in town at 1:30 and brought it back and reframed the photograph and hung it back on its nail between the beer clock and the fire extinguisher case, and he stood in front of it for about a minute afterward. And then he went and got a rag and wiped down the taps. At 2, he called Wren at the room over the hardware store and told her the place was closed Saturday night for a private thing and not to come in. She asked, what private thing? He said, a family thing. She said, whose family? He said he would see her Monday, and to keep the arm dry. And Ren Odell hung up that phone and stood in a rented room over a hardware store with her right forearm wrapped in white gauze from wrist to elbow. And she looked at that phone for about 10 seconds, and then she went and got her keys. Because she was 20 years old, and she had spent 14 months learning exactly how that man told the truth. And he had just told her a lie, with the same voice he had used in September, when he said it would blow over. Now, before I take you to 5:20, I have to tell you what he did between 2 o'clock and 5 o'clock. And you have to have it because otherwise you will not believe what one man did in that building that night. He was not waiting. He was working. At 2:15, he called Dutch Van Eck and told him not to come in that night, and to call the other 6 and tell them the same. Dutch said, Rue. Emmett said, Dutch, I am asking. And Dutch Van Eck said, all right, and hung up the phone and sat down in his kitchen. And if you think that is where those 7 men's part of this story ends, you have not been listening. Then Emmett Carver went into the kitchen and moved the mat, and got the flat bar out of the utility drawer, and lifted a section of floorboard by the stove that he had cut himself in 1998, and took out a green steel ammunition box with a rubber gasket in the lid. He carried it out and set it on the bar. He did not open it right away. He wiped the dust off the top of it with his palm. Then he opened it with both hands. There was a folded piece of oilcloth. There were 2 photographs. One of a woman on a motorcycle at 23 years old, with her hair blown sideways and her mouth open laughing. And one of a field full of bikes at Ashfall Creek that was the same photograph as the one on the wall, only sharper. Only the print somebody had actually given him. And on the back of that one, in pencil, in a hand that was not his, there was a phone number with an area code from another state. And under the oilcloth there was one thing. It was a disc of steel, 4 inches across and 1/4 inch thick, hand cut with a torch and ground smooth on the edges by somebody who took pride in it. And there was a hole punched in the top of it, and stamped into the face of it with letter punches, 1 strike at a time, slightly uneven, was a single word and a date. There were 14 of them made. There is no way for me to tell you what it was worth without telling you what it was. And what it was the plain physical fact that everything that happened at Ashfall Creek had happened, and that the man holding it had sat at the head of that table, and that every organization that put a signature on that page had agreed to a thing that has never been written down anywhere else. Anybody from that world who saw it would know it in half a second. Anybody who was not from that world would think it was a piece of scrap. Emmett Carver picked it up with 2 hands. He held it for a while. Then he put it back in the box on top of the oilcloth and closed the lid. And at 5:11, headlights came into the gravel lot, and it was a little green car with a Tennessee plate and a bad rear tire, and Ren Odell got out of it. She came in the front door at 5:20 in the evening. Her right arm was wrapped in white gauze from the wrist to just below the elbow, and there was a stain coming through it the color of weak tea. She had on a hooded sweatshirt and jeans, and her hair was down for the first time anybody there could remember. And in her left hand, held down along her leg, was a 4-way tire iron. A cross. 4 sockets, the long arm about 2 feet, cold-rolled steel, the kind that lives in the trunk of every car anybody in that county had ever owned. She walked to the bar, and she put it on the oak with a sound that stopped everything. And she stood there with her chin up and her eyes wet and her jaw set. And here is what she found. Because those 7 old men had done exactly
what you would have done. They were all there, every one of them. Dutch Van Eck had made 6 phone calls Saturday afternoon and had said the same 7 words to each of them, which were, "He told us not to come in." And at 10 minutes to 5, 6 trucks had pulled into that gravel lot, and 7 men in vests with gray in their beards had walked into that building and sat down where they always sat. And Emmett Carver had come out from behind the bar and stood there and looked at them. And Marvin Kroll had said, without looking up, "Rue, we already sat still once." So the room she walked into had 8 people in it, and she put a tire iron down on the bar in front of all of them. And Dutch Van Eck, 71 years old, looked at that thing lying on the oak and said, out loud, in a voice that cracked in the middle of it, "What in Sam Hill is that for?" And Ren Odell said, "It is for whoever comes through that door first." Nobody laughed. I want that understood. Not one man in that room laughed at a 115-pound, 20-year-old girl with a burned arm standing in front of a tire iron. And if you have ever wondered what a room full of old men is actually worth, that is the answer. That right there. Sonny Deal said, "Honey," and she turned on him so fast he sat back. She said, "Do not honey me." She said, "I have been in this county 14 months, and I have never asked one of you for anything." And Boo Latimer said, "How did you even know?" And she said, "Because he called me at 2 o'clock and lied to me, and he does not lie." And then it came out of her all at once, standing there with her hand flat on that bar. She said she had been at the hardware store at 4, and heard 2 men in the aisle talking about how something was going to happen out on 12 tonight. She said she had driven out to the Tolliver yard on Quarry Road and sat in her car on the shoulder 200 yards down and counted 11 vehicles in a gravel lot at 4:30 on a Saturday when a route service company has nothing whatever to do. She said, "I counted them." And Ray Pyle said, "You did what?" And she said it again, louder. And then she said the thing that made a 67-year-old man put both hands on his own bar. She said, "I know what you all think this is." She said, "You think it is about my arm." She said, "It is not about my arm." And she pulled the sleeve of that sweatshirt up over the gauze, and she said, "This is going to be a scar. And I already have scars, and I did not get to pick any of the other ones." She said, "I am picking this one." Now, the club had to decide whether she got to be the one who swung it. And I'm going to give you that argument the way it happened, because it is the moral center of this entire thing, and everything after it is just weather. Cricket Neep said she was not swinging anything, and he said it the way a grandfather says it, and it was the wrong thing to say, and he knew it before he finished. Preacher Tom Amos said, "She has got the right." He said it quietly, and everybody turned around, and he said it again. He said, "It was her arm." And Sonny Deal said, "She is 20 years old." And Tom Amos said, "And how old were we?" And that shut Sonny Deal up for a good while. Marvin Kroll had not said anything. He was sitting with his hands around a cup of coffee he had not drunk. And he said, without looking up, that there was a difference between the right to do a thing and the good of doing it. He said, "Everybody in this room who has swung one is quieter than everybody in this room who has not. And there is a reason for that. And it is not modesty." And Dutch Van Eck said, "Marv." And Marvin Kroll looked up and said, "I am not saying she cannot. I am saying it is not a prize." And through all of it, Emmett Carver had not said one word. He was standing behind his bar with a towel over his shoulder and both hands flat on the oak on either side of that tire iron. And he was looking at it the way you look at a photograph of somebody. And when the room ran out, he reached out and picked it up with two hands. And every man in there thought he was going to take it away from her and put it behind the bar, and that would be the end of it. He did not. He turned it over once, feeling the balance of it the way a man does with a tool, and then he set it back down on the oak in front of her, closer to her than it had been, so that it was hers. And he said, "You can keep it." And then he said, "And you are not going to swing it." And she opened her mouth, and he said, "Hear me." And this is what a 67-year-old man said to a 20-year-old girl in a roadhouse on a Saturday evening in October, with 19 men on their way, and 8 witnesses have never gotten it wrong in the telling, which almost never happens. He said, "The second you swing that, it is yours." He said, "Not the swing. What comes after the swing?" He said, "It does not go away, and it does not get lighter, and there is no day ever when you set it down, and it stays down." He said, "I have carried mine since before your mother was born, and I will tell you exactly what it is worth." He said, "I could not use it to help you on Thursday." And his voice did not change at all when he said that, and Dutch Vanek put his hand over his mouth. He said, "That is what it is worth." And she said, "Then why are you still here?" And he said, "Because I am already carrying it, and there is no more room on me for it to take up." Then he looked at the 7 of them, and he told them to go home. And he did not ask this time. Dutch Vanek said no, and Emmett Carver came around the end of that bar and stood in front of a 71-year-old man with an oxygen bottle in his truck, and he put his hand on Dutch's shoulder, and he said, "Dutch, listen to me. If you sit in that chair tonight, I will spend the whole thing watching that chair instead of the room, and then they will get me, and it will be because you loved me." He said, "Do not do that to me." And that is how you send 7 proud men out of a building without taking one thing away from them. They went. It took 11 minutes, and Boo Latimer could not get his truck started and had to be jumped, and stood there crying while Ray Pyle hooked the cables up, 63 years old, in a gravel lot, with his hands over his face. And when they were gone, Emmett Carver turned to Wren Odell and said, "You too." And she said no. So he did the only thing left, and it was a piece of tactics, and it was also the single kindest thing that man ever did in his life. He went and got the green steel box off the back bar, and he put it in her hands, and he said, "If this ends badly, this does not go in a police property room, and it does not end up in a glass case in some man's den. This goes in the ground with me." He said, "That is a job, and it is the only one I have got for you, and it has to be done by somebody who is not here." And she took it, because he had made it the one thing she could do for him, and because he had said the words, "Not here," and because at 20 years old, she had never once in her life been handed something to hold. She went out the back with a steel box under one arm and a tire iron in her good hand, and she got in a little green car with a Tennessee plate, and she drove out of that gravel lot at 4 minutes past 6 in the evening. She got exactly 6/10 of a mile. There is a gravel turnout at the top of the grade, east of the dog iron, where the county keeps a pile of road salt under a tarp, and it sits maybe 40 feet above the level of the highway, and from it you can see the roof and the sign, and the whole lot laid out below you like a model of itself. She pulled in there and shut the engine off, and sat with a steel box on the passenger seat. That is what he meant when he told a man on the phone that the only ones worth anything are the ones who are somewhere else. She was somewhere else. She was just not far enough else. And at 22 minutes past 6, sitting in the dark in that turnout, Wren Odell opened that green box. Because she was 20 years old, and she had been holding it for 18 minutes, and there is not a person listening to this who would not have opened it. She lifted the lid. She looked at a piece of oilcloth and 2 photographs, and a disc of steel with a word stamped into it that meant nothing to her at all. And she turned the ashfall photograph over, and there was a phone number in pencil, in another man's handwriting, with an area code from a state 400 miles away. She called it at 6:31 in the evening. It rang 9 times. And then there was a click and a recording. And it was not a name. It was a man's voice saying just the last 4 digits of the number back, the way men of a certain kind have always done it. And then a beep. And Wren Odell, 20 years old, sitting in a car above a roadhouse with her arm throbbing inside the gauze, left a message on a stranger's machine. And her voice was shaking so hard on it that when it was played in a courtroom 9 months later, the judge had them play it twice. She said, "My name is Wren. I work for Emmett Carver at the dog iron on Route 12 outside Kettle Ford." She said, "There are 19 men coming here tonight to kill him." And then she did not know how to end a phone call like that. So she said, "I am sorry," and hung up. Meanwhile, in that building, an old man was getting ready. And I want to walk you through it, because the preparation is the whole reason there was anybody left to save. At 6:15, he locked the front door and turned the sign. At 6:20, he unplugged the jukebox at the wall, because a jukebox is 400 pounds of glass, and it stands in a lane. He put every chair up on every table except 4, and those 4 he set out in the middle of the floor in a rough line about 8 feet in front of the bar, spread out at odd angles, not blocking anything, just there, because a man coming into a dark room at speed does not see a chair leg. He took the bar mats up off the floor behind the bar and threw them in the kitchen, because a rubber mat rolls under your heel. He filled 2 sinks with water. He put a case of pint glasses on the back bar within reach, and he did not do that to throw them. He took the fire extinguisher out of its case on the wall and set it on the floor at the end of the bar, standing up, pin pulled. He went down the hall and unlocked the back door, and then propped the fire door at the end of the hallway all the way open with a wedge, because an open door behind you is an argument you do not have to have. He walked it twice. Front door to the end of the bar, 11 paces. End of the bar to the pass-through window, 4. The gap between the end of the bar and the wall, 31 inches, which meant 1 man at a time, and no swinging room for anything longer than an arm. He stood behind the oak with his back to the back bar, and he looked at the room the way a man looks at a hand of cards, and he counted the angles out loud to himself, and he said a number twice. And then he reached up under the overhang at the 3rd stool and put 2 fingers on a hickory axe handle in 2 spring clips. a place he had checked every single morning for 22 years and had never once needed. Then he made a pot of coffee. That is not a metaphor. At 7:03 in the evening, alone in a locked building with 19 men coming, Emmett Rue Carver made a fresh pot of coffee and poured himself a cup in a white diner cup with a green stripe and set it on the bar and did not drink one swallow of it. It was still sitting there, cold, full to the top, when the sheriff's people photographed that room at 11:40 that night, and there is a picture of it in a file in Kettle Ford to this day. At 7:30 he went and stood in front of the photograph on the wall for a while with the new glass in it. At 7:20 he took the wedding band on its chain out from under his shirt and looked at it and put it back. At 8:00 he turned off every light in that building except the two over the bar and the one in the hall, because a man's eyes are the only equipment he has left at 67, and he wanted them dark adapted, and because a room where the lights are wrong makes people come in slower. And then he stood there. For an hour and 11 minutes, he stood behind his own bar in the half-dark, with his hands on the oak, not pacing, not sitting. And up on the grade in a turnout 6/10 of a mile east, a girl watched the two lit windows of that building through a windshield and did not blink enough. At 9:09, headlights came around the bend by the creek. They came in slow. That was the first thing that told him. 7 vehicles, and they did not roar in and slide the gravel. They came in like a funeral procession and parked in a line across the front of the lot, facing the building with their lights on and their engines running, which is a thing men do when they are working themselves up, and also when they have been told to. 19 men got out and did not immediately walk to the door, and Emmett Carver watched their shapes cross in front of those headlights and counted them twice. And then he understood something that changed everything. And here it is. They were careful. 2 of them went around the west side toward the back. 2 more went to the east corner. Nobody rushed. That is not how 19 men come to break up a building. That is how 19 men come at somebody they have been told about. Which meant they knew. Which meant Hoyt Breedlove's story had gotten into every one of them and had not made a single one turn around. And that is a specific kind of man. A fool who does not know what he is walking into is dangerous by accident. People who know exactly what they are walking into and walk in anyway are a different breed of dangerous entirely. 67 years old, alone in a building he had opened at 11:20 every morning for 22 years, outnumbered 19-1, and still, by a wide distance, the most dangerous thing within 500 yards of that gravel lot. The front door came in at 9:11. They did not kick it. Somebody put a Halligan bar in the jamb and popped it, which takes about 4 seconds and makes a sound like a tree coming apart. And then they came through. And they came through in twos, and the first 4 spread wide the way you spread out to take a room, and 2 of them went straight down the wall toward the hall to cut it. Del Prine came in 4th with an axe handle in his right hand, and he was grinning, and behind him at a distance came Merritt Tolliver, 26 years old, in a clean quarter-zip pullover, with his hands empty and one of them in his front pocket. And Merritt Tolliver started talking. He stood 11 feet from the end of the bar, with men flowing around him on both sides, and he started making a speech. And it was a good speech, and I will give you the shape of it. He said he had come out here personally, which he wanted noted. He said this had never had to be like this. He said $180 a month, and he said the number twice, and he said, "Do you understand that this whole thing, all of this, everything in this room right now, is $180. And you know what? He was right. He was more right than he knew. It was $180 a month.
That is what all of it cost. That is what it always costs. Emmett Carver did not answer him, because the men were still moving. 2 had gone left along the fireplace wall and were coming down toward the far end of the bar where the gap was, and 3 had come right and were behind the 4 chairs he had set out in the floor, and 1 man, thin, wet hair flat to his skull, had come in last and had gone straight to the wall beside the door and put his back against it with his right hand inside his coat. Cawley. The same wall, the same hand. So he did not answer the words, he answered the spread. And he went first, and he did not go for Del Prine. Every man in that room, and every man who has ever told this story since, expected him to go for Del Prine. He went for Cawley. He came off the back bar and down that 22 feet of oak faster than any of them were ready for. And he did not go around the end, he went over it. 1 hand flat on the lip, hip across the wood, and he landed in the gap between the last stool and the wall, and he covered the 8 feet to that door in 3 steps. And he took Cawley's right forearm through the coat with his left hand, and put it against the wall and hit him once with the heel of his right hand under the jaw. And the back of Cawley's head hit the cinder block, and he went down the wall and sat there. And Emmett Carver put his hand in that coat and came out with a folding knife with a 4-inch blade, and looked at it, and threw it behind the bar into a sink full of water. 4 seconds. And then the room came apart. Now, the first fight, on Thursday, had lasted 2 seconds. This one was not fast. This one was a war. And I'm going to tell it to you in order, and I am not going to enjoy it, and neither did he. He got his back to the end of the bar in the gap, 31 inches wide, so that they could only come at him from the front and one at a time, and nobody could get behind him. And he made every single man who came through that gap pay full price for it. That is not poetry. That is geometry. And geometry is the only reason a 67-year-old man was still standing at 9:20. The first one through was a big kid from Sinclair, with a length of log chain wrapped around his fist, and he swung it wide because there was nowhere to swing it, and it hit the bar rail, and Emmett came inside of it and put an elbow into his throat, and the kid went down on his knees making a sound like a stuck door. The second one had rebar, and he came in short and jabbing, and Emmett took the third jab on his left forearm, and it broke something in there. And he took the bar out of that man's hands and threw it down the length of the bar top, where it slid off the end and clattered. And he put that man's face into the oak lip once. 2 men tried to come over the bar from the customer's side to get behind him, and he was already turning, and the first one came down onto the drain board and got a handful of the case of pint glasses, and Emmett hit him with the flat of the ice scoop, of all things. And the second one saw that and did not come. 22 seconds in, he had a broken left forearm, and he never mentioned it. Not that night. They found it 3 days later on an X-ray he only got because Wren threatened to quit. Del Prine came through the gap at 41 seconds, with the axe handle up over his shoulder, and he was still grinning, and he said something, and I do not know what he said, and neither does anybody else, because he did not finish it.
Emmett Carver stepped into him, not back, in, so the handle came down behind his shoulder instead of on it, and he took Prine's wrist with his right hand and turned it the way you turn a valve. And Del Prine's elbow went the wrong direction, and the axe handle hit the floor, and Emmett Carver put him down on the boards on his face and stood on his back for 1 second, just one, and then stepped off him and picked up the handle. And here is the thing you have to hear about that. Del Prine, the man who poured a pot of coffee down a 20-year-old girl's arm for 2 seconds and walked out laughing. He was on the floor. He was face down, and his right arm did not work. And Emmett Carver had a hickory axe handle in his hand, and 40 years of exactly how to use it. And he had every reason a man on this earth has ever had. And he stepped off him and went back to the gap. Because the room was not clear. Because there were still 15 men in that building. Because it was not paying back yet. It was still protecting. And the second it stopped being one and started being the other, a promise made at the foot of a grave in 1997 came due. He held that gap for 2 minutes and 50 seconds. In a courtroom later, they timed it off a recording, and a lawyer said the number out loud, and the jury foreman put his hand over his mouth. 2 minutes and 50 seconds is a very long time. Count it sometime, sitting still, in a chair, in your house. Now do it with 11 men coming at you. He used the axe handle for maybe 30 seconds, and then a man got both hands on it, and Emmett let it go rather than get pulled out of the gap, which was the correct decision, and which cost him, because the man who had it swung it and caught him across the ribs on the right side and cracked 2 of them. He picked the fire extinguisher up off the floor and used it, not as a club, as an extinguisher. One long blast of dry chemical into 3 faces at 4 feet, and the whole west end of that bar room went white and blind and coughing. And that bought him 11 seconds, and it is the single smartest thing anybody did in that building all night. He put the empty bottle into the shins of the next man through. His body was reminding him, joint by joint, the whole time, that he was not the man he had been at 30. His left arm was broken, and he was fighting with it anyway, using the elbow. His right knee had a piece of grit in it since 1983. 2 ribs. Somewhere in there a ring caught him over the left eyebrow and opened it. And after that he was fighting through a curtain of his own blood on that side, and could not see anything coming from his left. He was 67 years old, and he had been going for 2.5 minutes, and he had nothing left in his lungs, and his hands had gone stupid on him. But 4 decades had not taken the one thing that had always mattered most about that man. In a fight, he simply did not stop. At 2 minutes and 11 seconds, a man named Ronnie Pell got a piece of 1/2-inch rebar up over his head and brought it down. And Emmett got his broken left forearm up and took it there instead of on his skull. And the sound of that was heard by a girl standing 40 feet away on the other side of a pane of glass. And for one long, terrible second, the whole bar room tilted sideways in front of his eyes, and he went down onto his right knee in the gap with one hand on the bar rail. Every man left standing in that room believed they were about to watch that old man go down for good. So did he. He did not go down. He came up off that knee using the bar rail, and he came up under Ronnie Pell and took him off his feet entirely and put him into the corner of the fireplace hearth. And Ronnie Pell did not get up again that night. And the next man in the gap looked at that and stopped. And that stop is what saved his life and everybody else's. Because at 2 minutes and 50 seconds into it, the room went quiet all on its own. Nobody called it. It just stopped. The way a machine stops when a belt comes off. 15 men standing in a room in a haze of dry chemical powder and broken glass, breathing hard, and every one of them looking at a 67-year-old man on his feet in a 31-inch gap with his back against the end of his own bar. His left arm was hanging. His right eyebrow was split, and the whole right side of his face was sheeted red. He was down on the balls of his feet with his weight forward. 4 of their people were on the floor and not getting up. And every single one of those 15 men had just done the same arithmetic at the same time, which was, somebody has to go first, and I do not want it to be me. And that is the exact moment Merritt Tolliver took a .38 caliber revolver out of the front pocket of his pullover. A gun changes a fight. It does not matter how skilled a man is, how tough, how willing, how much geometry he has got. 22 feet of oak, and 2 minutes and 50 seconds, and 40 years of everything he ever learned, and a 26-year-old with a 5-shot revolver takes all of it off the table in the time it takes to lift your arm. The room went silent, and I mean silent. 15 men stopped breathing at once, and the only sound in the Dog Iron Roadhouse, and 8 men have testified to this, was the ice machine behind the bar going through its cycle, that low grind and then the clatter of it dumping into the bin, because a machine does not know anything about what is happening in a room. Merritt Tolliver's hands were shaking, both of them. He had that revolver out at the end of 2 arms, and it was moving in a circle about the size of a coffee cup, and he was 26 years old, and everything he had built in 18 months had come down to standing in a wrecked barroom, pointing his dead uncle's pistol at a bleeding old man. And you could see on his face that he had arrived somewhere he had never once pictured. He had never crossed this line. Every single thing he had ever done had been done by other people at other addresses while he was 2 counties away with a receipt in his pocket. He said, "Get on the floor." And his voice broke on the word floor. And Emmett Carver did not get on the floor. He stood up out of his crouch, slowly, and he let his right hand hang open at his side, and he spoke to that young man in exactly the same quiet voice he had used across a bar in September, the one that made people lean in. He said, "Son?" He said, "Look at me." And then he told him what would happen. And he told it like a man reading a schedule. He said, "You have got 5 in there." He said, "If you use one, and it does not finish me, I'm going to take it off you. And you know that, or you would not be shaking." He said, "And if it does finish me, then in about 40 minutes, you are a 26-year-old with a murder in a county where you have got 14 men standing right there who all watched you do it." He said, "And not one of them is going to prison for you." He said, "You have not paid a one of them enough for that." He said, "Ask them." And that is the exact moment, with a gun up and a room full of men doing sums, that the front door of the Dog Iron opened. Wren Odell had watched the trucks come in from that turnout 6/10 of a mile east. She had watched the door get popped. She had come down that road with her lights off and put a little green car in the ditch at the end of the lot, and come up along the west side of that building in the dark past 2 men who were supposed to be watching the back, and were watching the fight through the window instead. And she had stood at the kitchen pass-through with a pane of glass on a slide track between her and it, and she had watched the last minute and a half of it, with her left hand over her mouth and her right arm burning inside the gauze, and she had not breathed properly in 90 seconds, and she had seen a man she loved go down on one knee. And she went around to the front, and before she came through that broken door, she took the 4-way tire iron out of her hand, and she set it down, on the step, outside, deliberately, with a little tap of steel on concrete that 3 men heard and none of them understood at the time. And she came in with a green ammunition box held against her chest in both arms, and nothing else. She got 4 steps into that room, and she stopped, and every head turned, and she was the smallest thing in the building by 70 pounds. And she said, in a voice that was not shaking anymore, and nobody has ever been able to explain that either, she said, "Merritt Tolliver." And a 26-year-old with a revolver in his hands actually flinched at his own name. And Wren Odell opened that green steel box in front of the whole room and took out a 4-inch disc of hand-cut steel with a word and a date stamped into it. and she held it up over her head in her burned right hand, high, where the two lights over the bar caught it. And she said, "Do you know what this is?" Now, not one man in that room from Merritt Tolliver's generation had the first idea what she was holding. It looked like a piece of scrap off a shop floor, and it did not matter one bit, because standing 11 feet inside that broken front door, where he had been standing since the beginning because he could not make himself do anything else, was Hoyt Breedlove, 62 years old, with his canvas cap in his hands. And Hoyt Breedlove looked at that disk of steel and said, out loud, involuntarily, the way a man says something in church, "Oh no." And that was the reveal. It did not come from her, and it did not come from the old man, and it did not come from me. It came off the face of a frightened 62-year-old bookkeeper who had held the gate on a horse trailer in 1981, and 15 men who had never heard of Ashfall Creek in their lives turned around and looked at him and read it off him like a sign on a road. And then Wren Odell delivered the bluff, and I want you to understand what it was made of, because she did not invent one word of it. She said, "He called it Thursday night." She said, "There were 14 of these made, and every one of them is a promise. And he has never used his, not one time in 38 years. And he used it Thursday." She said, "They have been coming since noon." She said, "There are men on Route 12 right now who got on a bike this morning 400 miles from here to stand in the parking lot of a building they have never been in." And then she said the last part, and she said it looking straight at Merritt Tolliver. And it is the finest sentence anybody said in this entire story. She said, "You have got 5 bullets and about 11 minutes." It was a bluff, and it was not a bluff. She had made one phone call at 6:31 in the evening into a machine in a state 400 miles away and gotten a beep. And she had no idea on God's earth whether one living person had heard it. And that disk of steel in her hand was exactly what she said it was. And every word she said about it was true. And Hoyt Breedlove's face had already told 15 men that the true part was true. So they had no way of sorting which half was which. That is the whole craft of it. You do not lie. You tell them a true thing they can check and one thing they cannot, and you let them do the rest themselves. And you could watch the math land in real time. It went around that room man by man like a light going down a row. A kid by the cigarette machine put his hands up at nothing and started walking backward. 2 of the Sinclair men looked at each other, and one of them said, and just went, straight out the front door, walking, not running, and got in a truck. Somebody in the back said, "Merritt," and it was not a question, it was a resignation. Because every one of those men was doing the same arithmetic Emmett Carver had handed them 30 seconds earlier, and now the arithmetic had a second column in it. And the second column said that whatever was on that road was coming, whether they finished this or not. And the only variable left was whether they were standing in this building when it got here. And it failed. For all of them. Every single one. Merritt Tolliver stood there with a revolver in 2 shaking hands and his whole world falling off the edges of the table. And he looked at the old man, and the old man had not moved 1 inch through any of it, and had not raised his voice, and was standing there, bleeding onto his own floor with his left arm hanging and his eyes perfectly steady. And the gun came down first, slow, like the weight of it had finally won an argument his arm had been losing for a minute and a half. Emmett Carver walked across that floor. It took him 5 steps, and every one of them cost him something. And he put his right hand out, palm up, open, and he waited. He did not snatch it. He waited. And Merritt Tolliver, 26 years old, put his dead uncle's revolver into a 67-year-old man's hand and let go of it, and then put both his hands over his face and stood there in the middle of a wrecked barroom and cried like the boy at the gas station. And it was over. Truly over this time. Emmett Carver opened that revolver and dumped 5 rounds out into his palm and put them in his shirt pocket and set the pistol on the bar next to a full cup of cold coffee. And then he turned around, and he did not look at Merritt Tolliver, and he did not look at Del Prine on the floor, and he walked past all of it to a 20-year-old girl standing in the middle of his barroom with an empty steel box, and he said, "Let me see your arm." That was the first thing out of his mouth. Not to the men, not to the boy. He tended the hurt before he ever addressed the beaten, and he did it in front of 15 witnesses. And if you want to know what that man was in one gesture, that is the one. They left the way people leave a funeral. Quiet, careful, nobody looking back. 15 men, and the ones who could walk carried the ones who could not, out through a popped door into a gravel lot lit by their own headlights. And there was no shouting, and no threats, and nobody peeled out. Doors shut. Engines started. And one at a time, they pulled out onto Route 12 and went west toward Kettle Ford. And the whole thing took about 4 minutes. And the last vehicle out was Hoyt Breedlove's, and he was the only one who stopped at the road. And he sat there at the end of that lot with his blinker on for a good while before he turned. Merritt Tolliver did not go with them. He sat down on the floor of that barroom with his back against the fireplace wall next to 2 andirons older than anybody in the county. And he stayed there, and nobody made him. Emmett Carver got 2 clean bar towels and a scoop of ice and made a compress and put it on his own eyebrow. And then he sat down on a stool on the customer side of his own bar for the second time in 22 years. And he sat there beside a 20-year-old girl who would not stop shaking now that it was safe to. The first county car came at 9:41. 2 deputies came through that door with their hands where their hands go, and what they found was a room with 400 pounds of broken furniture in it, and a white haze of dry chemicals still hanging at the ceiling, and blood on the boards in 3 places. And one old man sitting on a stool with a towel full of ice on his face, and one young man sitting on the floor by the fireplace with his knees up, and one girl with her arm in gauze, and a revolver lying on the bar with the cylinder open next to a full cup of coffee that had gone cold hours before anybody put a door in. Sheriff Orville Keach got there at 14 minutes past 10. 31 years with that county. And this is worth telling you, because he did 2 things that night that men who have worn that star for 31 years mostly do not do. He parked at the end of the gravel and walked in the rest of the way, on foot. And he came in wearing a barn coat and a pair of jeans, not in uniform, deliberately, at 10 at night, having gotten out of bed. He stood in that doorway and looked at the room for a while. And then he crossed the floor and pulled up a chair that was not broken, and sat down in front of a bleeding 67-year-old bartender and said, "Emmett?" Nobody in Hale County had called that man Emmett in 22 years. Everybody called him Rue. Orville Keach had known better since about 2003, and he had never once let on. And he picked that night to spend it. And then he said, "I have got a young man sitting over there against your fireplace, and I have got a pistol on your bar with the rounds out of it. And before I ask you one single question, I want to say a thing out loud in front of this girl." He said, "I told Ansel Tolliver in my office 4 years ago that his nephew was going to get somebody killed, and I put my finger on a piece of paper and told him what would happen, and I never wrote it down anywhere, and that is on me." And then he did the other thing. About 11 minutes later, at 10:25, the first of them came up Route 12 from the east. Not a car. You could hear it 4 miles out on a cold night in October, and everybody in that gravel lot turned and looked, including 2 deputies with their hands on their belts. And they came around the bend by the creek in 2s and 3s, and then in 6s, and then they just kept coming. And they filled that lot, and then they filled the shoulder on both sides of the highway for a 1/4 mile, and the county had to send 2 more cars just to sit in the road with their lights on. And by 11:30, there were 61 motorcycles and 11 trucks parked outside the Dog Iron Roadhouse. They came from 4 states. The nearest of them was from 3 counties over, and the farthest of them had been on the road since 7 that evening, off 1 phone call that started another phone call that started 9 more. Some of them were 60, a few of them were 75. There were men in that lot who had not spoken to each other since 1984 because of things that had happened in that war. And they parked next to each other. And here is the part that made the paper in 3 counties, and that I would not believe if there were not photographs of it. They did not do one single thing. Not one. They did not go inside. They did not shout. They did not touch a Tolliver vehicle, and there were 2 still sitting there. Every one of them parked square, kept the highway clear, kept the fire lane open, produced a license when asked, and stood in a gravel lot in the cold for 4.5 hours, doing absolutely nothing at all, in perfect view of the law, obeying every rule on the books with a precision that was itself the loudest thing anybody in Hale County ever heard. 2 deputies walked that lot for 2 hours with a notebook and did not write one line in it, because there was nothing to write, and that, right there, was the point. Sheriff Keech stood on that step at midnight and looked at 61 motorcycles and told the youngest deputy he had, and the man repeated it in a deposition. He said, "Son, that is not a mob." He said, "A mob you can do something about." They never went in. Around 3 in the morning, somebody started an engine, and then it went down the line, and they left the way they came, in 2s and 3s, east and west. And by 4, the lot was empty, except for the county cars and a tow truck. Not one of them ever spoke to Emmett Carver that night. He never came outside. He was in the back with a paramedic arguing about whether he was going to Bell County. And he lost that argument for the first time in his life. Because a 20-year-old girl with a burned arm stood in the doorway and said she would call his hospital every hour until they told her he was there. Now the aftermath, and stay with me, because this is where it actually pays. This is the part that matters more than the fight ever did. Here is the accumulating machinery of it, all in one breath, the way it actually came down over 9 months. The camera over the register in the Dog Iron, a cheap 4-channel unit Emmett Carver installed in 2006 after somebody took a cash drawer, that every single person in that county, including its owner, assumed had quit working years ago, had recorded every second of Thursday the 10th and every second of Saturday the 12th onto a hard drive in a locked cabinet in the office, in color, with a time and date stamp, including audio, including $180 a month said out loud twice by Merritt Tolliver in his own voice in a building he had come to destroy, and including one warning offered at 6:14 on a Thursday evening to a man with a coffee pot in his hand,
And 11 days after that Saturday, 9 businesses on that route came into the sheriff's office on their own feet. And then there were 14 of them. And then there were 26. And Ola Beecham, 73 years old, brought a shoebox with 41 months of receipts in it, in date order, with the cord off one of her hair dryers laid across the top. And Hoyt Breedlove walked into the state investigator's office with the route books, the actual books, both sets, and gave a statement that ran 43 pages. And Tolliver Asset Recovery and Route Services shut its gate for the last time, 31 days after that Saturday. And 11 men took pleas, and Del Prine got 14 years. And Merritt Tolliver, who never touched one person in his life, got 11. And then the small things started, which are the ones I actually want you to hear. The Kettleford Diner took the Tolliver vending machine out of its own front lobby, 3 men and a hand truck, and set it in the parking lot. And nobody came for it for 9 days. The feed store put a hand-lettered sign in the window that said, "We do not pay," and left it up for a year and a half. And Ola Beecham, who had been paying $180 a month for 15 months, which is $2,700 out of a 3-chair beauty shop in a town of 1,900 people, took her own sign down off the front of that building and repainted it herself, 73 years old, on a stepladder in November, and put it back up. That is the one. Of everything in this whole story, that is the one that gets me. Sheriff Orville Keach announced in February that he would not stand for a 7th term. Nobody made him. He had the votes. He gave one interview to a weekly paper with a circulation of 4,100, and he said, "I knew about the fee for a year and a half, and I told myself it was a civil matter."
He said, "A girl got scalded in a room with 9 people in it, and I want to be on the side of my own life where I said so out loud." Then he testified for 2 days, in a suit, and afterward he shook Hoyt Breedlove's hand in a hallway, and those 2 men had never met before in their lives. And 4 years later, an envelope came to the Dog Iron Roadhouse from a correctional facility, addressed in ballpoint to Miss Wren Odell, and inside it was 1 page. It did not ask for one thing. It did not ask her to write back, and it did not ask for forgiveness, and it did not make itself small, which is what most of them do. It said, "I was 9 years old and I watched my dad say sorry to a man who hit him, and I decided I would never say it to anybody, and I built the entire thing I built on top of that, and it cost a woman I have never met her arm." It said, "I have thought about the sound you made about 400 times." And then it said, "I am sorry." And that was the last line, and there was nothing after it but his name. Wren Odell read that letter standing at the end of a bar, and then went out the back and sat on a milk crate for 20 minutes. She never wrote back. She kept it, though. It is in a drawer under a register 9 miles east of Kettleford right now, folded in half, in with a lease and a fuel receipt and a hospital bill marked paid. And the reason it is in that drawer instead of a fire is that a man once told her that what comes after the swing is yours forever. And she decided she would rather carry a letter than a grudge. The town mostly let it lie. That is the thing about a county like that. Within 2 weeks, there were 4 versions of that Saturday night going around, and by the next summer, there were about 11. And in one of them, the old man broke a man's arm with one hand while holding a coffee pot in the other. And in another one, there were 200 motorcycles. And in another one, my favorite, he never got off his stool the entire time. And Emmett Carver never corrected a single one of them. Somebody would start telling it 3 stools down with him standing right there, and he would wipe the same 8 inches of bar over and over, and let the man finish, and then ask him if he wanted another one.
And nobody, in 6 years, ever once asked that man what the word stamped on that piece of steel was. Not one person. They decided, the whole county decided, without ever having a meeting about it, that his past was his own property, and that they had gotten quite enough of it, thank you. He was back behind that bar in 19 days with a cast on his left arm to the elbow, and he opened the door at 20 minutes to 11 in the morning, and Cricket Neep was standing outside it in the cold with 2 cups of gas station coffee, because he had been standing outside it at 20 to 11 every morning for 19 days on the chance. The 7 of them came back that Thursday, all 7, in the vests, and sat where they had always sat. And nobody ever said one word about Thursday the 10th in that building again as long as any of them lived. But there was a thing that changed and never changed back. From that November on, every one of those 7 men stood up when Wren Odell came out of the kitchen carrying a tray. Every time. 71-year-old Dutch Vanek with a bad hip, getting up off a stool for a 20-year-old waitress carrying a bus tub, 4 and 5 times a night for years until he died. She asked them to stop twice and then quit asking, because she figured out somewhere in there that it was not about her. It was about a Thursday, and it was the only apology those men had in them, and they made it every single time she walked through that door for the rest of their lives. The green steel box went back under the floor by the kitchen stove the following March. It took him that long, and I do not know why, and there is nobody left to ask. What is known is that he did it on a Sunday morning, with the doors locked and Wren Odell standing there because he asked her to be, and that he wiped the disc of steel with a cloth and put it on the oilcloth and put the 2 photographs on top of it, and closed the lid with both hands and set it in the floor, and put the board back, and stood on it, both hands going in, and both hands coming out. And it sat down there year after year after that, untouched, the way a fire extinguisher sits behind glass, not forgotten, just no longer needed. The tire iron he kept. That is the thing that gets me, of all the things. He never gave it back to her, and she never asked for it. And about a week after he got the cast off, he drove 2 nails into the wall behind the bar, up high, and hung a 4-way tire iron on them, crossways, about 18 inches under that photograph of a field full of motorcycles at Ashfall Creek in 1981. And it hung there. For strangers, it was a piece of decoration in a roadhouse, and about once a month somebody would ask what the story was, and whoever was behind that bar would say, "That came off a car," and change the subject. It is up there right now. It has never been used for anything, not on a car, not on a man, not one time in all the years since, and it never will be. And that is the entire point of it. Neither of those 2 ever talked about that Saturday much afterward, but something between them had shifted permanently in a way that never required words to be real. She stopped calling him Rue somewhere in that first winter, and started calling him Emmett, and he never remarked on it. In the spring after, she asked him one time, closing at 1:30 in the morning with the chairs up, what he had said out loud at that grave in 1997. And he told her. That is the only reason anybody knows. And then she asked him whether he had broken it on Saturday. And he thought about that for a good while with a rag in his hand. And he said, no. He said, I got right up to the line of it twice. He said, once with the boy on the floor, and once with the young one crying by the fireplace. And she said, what stopped you? And Emmett Carver said, you set the tire iron down on the step. He said, I heard it. He ran that place another 6 years. He opened the door at 20 minutes to 11 in the morning every day of them. In the 4th of those years, he made Wren Odell a partner on a single sheet of paper drawn up by a lawyer in Kettle Ford, and she cried about it in the parking lot in her car, which by then was a different car with a plate from this state on it. In the 5th year, his knees went and he started keeping a stool behind the bar and using it, and hated it. In the 6th year, he taught her to cut glass and to do the beer order and to bank the fireplace ash in the fall, even though nothing had been burned in it since before she was born. And she understood by about the 4th of those lessons what he was doing, and she let him do it and never let on. Emmett Rue Carver died on a Tuesday, in his own bed at 73 years old, in the house with the shed behind it. And there was no scene and no drama and nothing to tell. He went to sleep. Wren found him when he did not open at 20 to 11, because in the last stretch he had taken to opening on Tuesdays himself, just to keep his hand in. And by 4 minutes past 11, she was in that driveway. She said the shed door was standing open, and that a canvas cover was folded, which it had never been, and that she has never known what to make of that, and never will. About half the county came to the funeral. The church would not hold it, and they did it in the fire hall. There were 11 vests in the front 2 rows, and 4 of the 7 were still alive to wear theirs. There were people there who had driven a long way, and who nobody in Hale County could identify. Older men, quiet, who signed the book with first names only, and stood at the back and left before the meal. Hoyt Breedlove came, 68 years old by then, and sat by himself in the 4th row from the back, with his canvas cap in his hands, turning it over. And Wren Odell walked the length of that hall to shake his hand in front of everybody. And that took about 11 seconds, and it settled something for that man that 6 years had not. The stool second from the far end had been empty since 1997. After that Tuesday, there were 2. She never put a sign on either one. She did not have to. New people sit down on them about twice a year, and somebody finds a reason to move them, and the stools go back to being empty. And that is how it works, and how it will keep working. And there is not a thing written down about it anywhere. Wren Odell is 31 years old now. She opens that door at 20 minutes to 11 in the morning, and she has done it every day for 5 years. And if you ask her why not 11 o'clock, she will tell you it is just how the place runs. That is all she will tell you. She knows exactly why. She found out in a lawyer's office holding a death certificate with a time of death on a Tuesday morning in 1997 printed on it. And she went out and stood in a parking lot for a while. And then she came back in and finished signing. There was a scar on her right forearm from the heel of her hand to the inside of her elbow, 7 1/4 inches, and it has gone silver over the years, and she wears short sleeves. Now think back for a minute to where this whole thing started. A pot of coffee, a girl's arm, 7 men sitting still. It looked, in that first moment, like exactly what the world mostly is. The strong taking from the weak because they could, in a room full of people who did not stop it. Over $180 a month. It looked like an old man who had lost whatever he used to have, standing behind a bar with a towel on his shoulder, not moving. That is what Del Prine saw. That is what Merritt Tolliver saw when Hoyt Breedlove told him, and he said the words, "That man is 67 years old, and he pours beer." But that is the thing about quiet men. The quiet is not weakness. Sometimes the quiet is a choice made on purpose by somebody who has already been every single place that violence can take a person, and decided to walk back out of it and not go again. Restraint in a man who is not capable of anything else is just a description of him. Restraint in a man who is capable of the other thing is the highest form of strength there is. and it does not look like anything at all from the outside, which is exactly why it costs so much. He was not standing still on that Thursday because he could not move. He was standing still because he had told a woman in the ground that he would not pay anybody back, and because 2 seconds is 2 seconds, and because there is no version of crossing that floor that gets there in time. And he had to live inside all of that, with his own friends watching him. What Merritt Tolliver saw was a bartender. What he should have seen was a man who had set down a heavy thing a long time ago, on purpose, with both hands, and who would pick it back up exactly once, for exactly the right reason, and then set it down again for good. And what he should have seen in that girl was not a waitress. It was the only person in the whole county who was going to walk up to a broken door on a Saturday night with the choice of 2 things in her hands, and set the iron one down on the step. 2 seconds. That is what all of it was. 2 seconds of a man pouring coffee, and everything else. The 19 men, and the 7 vehicles, and the 11 years, and the 31 days, and the 61 motorcycles standing perfectly still in a gravel lot, obeying every law in the state. All of that came out of 2 seconds and $180 a month. And if you are listening to this, and there is somebody taking money from you that you never agreed to give, a fee that showed up in a letter, a friendly young man in a clean truck who lies awake worrying about your building, I will say this plainly, and then I will leave it alone. You do not have to sit with that by yourself. There are people whose actual job is that, at the state level and at the county level, and they are more interested in it than you think they are. And it does not take proof, and it does not take a shoebox in date order like Ola Beecham had. It only takes the phone call. You do not have to know how it ends before you make it. She did not. Here is what I have sat with out of the whole thing, and it is not the fight. The fight is honestly the least interesting part of it. What I keep coming back to is a 71-year-old man with a bad hip standing up off a bar stool 4 times a night for years because of something he did not do in 11 seconds one Thursday. And what I would like to hear from you is this specific thing. When she came through that broken door and stopped and set that tire iron down on the step outside, before she walked in with nothing but a box in her arms, what went through you? Would you have let her swing it? Be honest about it, because I think most of us would have, and I think that is worth talking about. Tell me down in the comments, and I will read it. I read every one of them, every single one, and I answer more of them than you would expect. And if this is your first time here, welcome. Sit down. What we do on this channel is long, slow, true-feeling stories about ordinary people who kept their word when it cost them everything to keep it, told properly, with all the parts left in. If that is the kind of thing you have been looking for and have not been able to find much of anymore, then come on in and stay a while. And subscribe, not because I am asking for a number, but because I would rather you did not have to go hunting for the next one. There are 2 more waiting for you on the screen right now, and one of them is about a man who walked 11 miles in the snow to return something that was not his. Thank you for staying to the end of this one. There are not many people left who will sit still for a story this long, and the fact that you did is the entire reason I get to keep telling them. This story is a work of fiction. It was inspired by general themes of loyalty, restraint, and standing up for people who cannot stand up for themselves. All persons, names, places, businesses, and events in it are fictitious, and any resemblance to real people, living or dead, or to actual events,
is entirely coincidental. It was made for entertainment.